Good afternoon. For those of you that are joining us online, and there will be people joining us online, this is an experiment. Okay, there's two experiments going on. I have to tell you, the first one we found out a few hours before, an hour before the heating wasn't working. So if you see the matrix, you are the heating element for one thing gets you. So you're heating the room. That's the first experiment. The second experiment is that was the first time that we're actually doing a hybrid meeting, but not allowing people to come online from Belgium. And it's probably not having people that this is going to be the way it's going to be. That anybody can come on the world except you got in Brussels, stuff like you know, to come, so this is how we're going to do it, or else we will not have. I mean, we try to do hybrid meetings, and everybody said home in the retail, but that doesn't work well. So you still have to give us a few moments because again, they can still need that. We somehow running around the roadblocks and I just have to take a beat to it. So for those of you who are online, please bear with us for a few more minutes until it gets around to come here from the other side of the room to realize. So a few more minutes, please. Some like this. Is it better like this? Sarah, can you hear me well like this? Box and has made it. Jake, I think this is, this is the good time that we're actually filling this room. So it's obviously a start in this. And there's a couple of things that are happening here. What I said is that the heating is not working in this room, so these people have come in earlier to heat up the room. So they have done so. But seriously speaking, and it's the other experiment going on right now, Jake, that is the fact that after 4 years or whatever it is after the COVID thing, we have tried every formula, and some of it has worked better than others. And in this case, now what we have, and we lost a lot of people because of these hybrid meetings. Usually people stay home and be done. But in this case, what we've done is that we have allowed hybrid for everybody else in Belgium. So there are people that are, when they're not in Belgium, there will be, we have people from India, others that have asked us to participate, so there will be, there's an international audience, and there are journalists that are in the room and listening to the Indian journalists that come to the architect. Let's make sure that you know the. So first of all, thank you very much for coming. Jake and I will be spending quite a few weeks now in Dubai, starting in the end of November. But ERCSD has always had a bit of a more globalist, if you want, mission, in the sense that we always thought that the international dimension and the global discussions that are happening in international fora are an important element. And Brussels, to my eternal surprise, when I came to Brussels many years now, I found out that the people in Brussels are vaguely interested in international stuff. They all very focused on line items in this bill or in that directive or the other directive. So it's a little bit like a beltway. These are people that are mostly focused on their day-to-day business. And the international stuff is somewhat interested, but not always interested. We have tried very hard, as you know, in the past to always have a pre-COP or post-COP meetings. But I think that more and more we do realize there's a connection, especially in this year where we have a global stocktake. And there is a global stocktake session that is happening tomorrow, as I believe that the Commission is having tomorrow, is putting on. But also there's a number of other issues that will be important, and they come at different angles. Some of them may mean something to you, some of them may not mean much to you. There's the issue that will punctuate the COP discussion. The Emiratis, I think they had a great time having this COP, but they're ending up with a COP with a very complex COP. There's a lot of issues that are in play, and at least in my view, it's not going to be a simple one. There's going to be a lot of discussions. So there will be issues such as, the finishing of Article 6, which may not be the start of the discussion, but something that needs to be done. There'll be issues about loss and damage. There will be issues around fossil fuel phase out. There will be issues about renewable energy targets. Some of them on the COP negotiation, some of them may be outside the COP negotiation. But all these things somehow come together. They're outside, inside. They somehow come together. They mean something. And one of the things that I've always wanted, and hopefully we can have that discussion today, is ask Jake to take us from his point of view, from the point of view of the UN. I think the Council has had the Council conclusion on this topic. But the things that the EU sees on the horizon as being important issues at the COP. But also, if maybe we can broach a little bit, Jake, as to what this could possibly mean for EU climate policy. Because in the end, if we can translate a little bit for what this means for most of the folks in their day-to-day life here, it probably makes it more real. So I don't want to make this too long and for me to speak, because they didn't come here to listen to me. They came here to listen to you. I thought that having a microphone would be a great idea, but I'm told that the microphone makes the sound worse. There are very sophisticated microphones in those speakers, so they seem to be working well, so they tell me. So without much ado, Jake, I pass it on to you, and then we can have a discussion in the room. Jake?
Oh, thanks, Andre. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming as well. It's great to see some familiar faces around the room. But I think what's filled the room is not me being here, but rather the importance that people accord to the issue of climate change and the recognition that these COPs that happen every year are extremely consequential in terms of setting the pace at which governments respond to that moment. I'm thinking about different ways of approaching this issue in describing the challenge ahead to you today. And what's in my head at the moment, of course, is that I have a new commissioner who's just joined a few weeks ago. And of course, the first question that he asked of us is, I'm going to be a minister for the first time at the COP. What is it that ministers are going to have to engage in as major issues in Dubai? And the way in which we explain this to him is that this is a COP like, in many ways, will resemble other COPs. There's a massive set of issues, as Andre suggested, that is part of the international agenda on climate change policy. There is a set of agendas that run under the subsidiary bodies and under the now 12 constituted bodies of the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement that will get some level of attention at every COP. But what makes this COP unique is the first and foremost the global stocktake. This is the part of the architecture of the Paris Agreement that we put in place in order to have to avoid having to constantly negotiate new treaties. This was going to be a treaty that basically had a self-renewing element to it, an ambition cycle that would ensure that every 5 years, parties would reflect on how far they've been able to make it so far in addressing the challenge of climate change on the basis of the best available science, with, of course, the IPCC and other international organizations providing that science, and then decide what it is that they would need to do next to make sure that we are all on a pathway to achieving the Paris Agreement's very ambitious goals, the temperature goals, which are very familiar, but also the implicit goal in the Paris Agreement that we achieve net zero global emissions by the middle of this century. So that's what the GST is about. It's that step, that moment where we convert from the technical analysis of what the science and the economics have been telling us into the political signals which indicate what it is that we need to do next. This COP won't deliver those outcomes fully because one of the key outcomes that we'll all be watching for, not just within the EU, but globally, is what the next round of nationally determined contributions, the targets that countries commit to under the Paris Agreement will look like, and whether they in aggregate put us more on a pathway to net zero than the ones we have currently. So those are the post-2030 targets. Those won't be delivered until 2 COPs from now, at COP30, which will be held in Belém in Brazil. So what we're going to get from this meeting instead are the political signals about the direction that the parties see that the international economy, the international energy system needs to be moving in, but also clear signals about what we expect specifically of parties as they come forward with their next round of NDCs. So that's the first challenge that, of course, ministers will be engaged in, that shaping that set of political messages. Most of them, I think the most heavily debated of them will focus on mitigation, on cutting emissions, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But as we all know, the Paris Agreement is comprehensive. It doesn't just talk about mitigation, it also asks what countries are doing individually and collectively to build their resilience to the impacts of climate change, that's what we refer to as adaptation, but also what the wealthier of the parties to the Paris Agreement are doing to help the less wealthy, the more vulnerable. In other words, means of implementation or finance. The global stock rate covers all of those issues and more, but those are the 3 main pillars of the GST. And there is always an expectation, particularly the EU, because we tend to push hard on mitigation, that it has to be balanced, and we come up with some answers as to what we're going to be doing collectively, not just on cutting emissions, but also on adaptation and on implementation. So that's the first big ministerial challenge. The second was not built into the machinery from the Paris Agreement from the outset, but was rather added to the Paris Agreement machinery or architecture in Sharm el-Sheikh when we agreed to establish new funding arrangements and a fund to provide assistance to particularly vulnerable developing countries when responding to the impacts of climate change. That's essentially answering the question of what if adaptation, the investment in resilience, isn't enough, and communities, societies, countries begin to experience climate change in a way that they can't immediately recover from. So these are the impacts of slow onset events. These are the impacts of extreme weather events. They are both economic impacts, but also non-economic impacts. And although there is an article in the Paris Agreement on this issue that we call loss and damage, which sets out a whole set of areas where the Paris Agreement parties agreed to strengthen their international cooperation on loss and damage, there was no financing mechanism or financing obligations specifically attached to the implementation of that article. That doesn't mean that there wasn't finance flowing from many international institutions and agencies to support countries recovering from climate change impacts. We see their work every day. In fact, we see their work more and more as those climate impacts are being felt. But this regime, the climate change regime, the Paris Agreement, did not have its own dedicated fund for that purposes. So under extreme amount of pressure, and I would acknowledge some significant resistance from the EU, not the resistance to funding particularly vulnerable developing countries in responding to loss and damage, but resistance to the idea that we needed a new and dedicated fund to do that. Despite that resistance, we agreed in light of other developments in Sharm el-Sheikh that we would establish such a fund and that we would work together with other parties over the course of this year to make that fund and those funding arrangements operational in time for Dubai. And once we made that commitment, the EU was fully behind it, and we've been participating very constructively with our partners in trying to finalize the design of that fund and the funding arrangements that will accompany it. We had hoped that that would have wrapped up, that we would have a clear set of recommendations from something called the Transitional Committee that was set up to carry forward the design of the fund by the end of last week, when the fourth meeting of that committee wrapped up its work in Aswan in Egypt. But we failed. We did not reach consensus. There are still significant issues that divide parties on that. And I can come back to those in detail if people want to focus on that. But we still have a lot of work to do. As a result of not being able to conclude that work, it will now be a key theme on the pre-COP, which will be held in Abu Dhabi next week, where ministers will convene for a couple of days, then heads of delegation will convene, and then now a newly scheduled meeting, TC5, the fifth meeting of the Transition Committee, will take place next weekend, and hopefully that will be able to resolve the final issues around loss and damage. But before we turn to the conversation and to any questions that you might have, I thought I would go back to the GST and in particular mitigation, because I know that that's where a lot of people are focusing their attention. They want to see how it is that this COP, because of the GST, but also because where it's hosted in the United Arab Emirates, can send signals that we really are on a pathway to a transformation of our economy, and particularly the energy sector, from where we are now, where we continue to depend very heavily on fossil fuels, where global emissions continue to rise, to a global pathway that gets us to net zero by 2050 and avoids the worst of climate change. I think that the European Council conclusions are a very interesting object study in predicting what might be discussed at the COP. Because in setting what we always like to think of as a very ambitious set of goals for our negotiators to take into the COP, we also had a lot of debates internally about exactly how to capture our vision of what that transformation looks like. So you will see some language that's been debated before around the phasing out of unabated fossil fuels. That's something that the European ministers agreed to commit to, and which we're hoping that the international community will commit to as well. Within that concept, you see European ministers struggling about whether they could retain or drop the word unabated, where some felt that using the word unabated to describe the pathway to net zero in relation to fossil fuels implies that you continue to intend to use fossil fuels, but that some technologies will be developed or scaled up in order to make it cost effective and good from an environmental perspective to simply capture from the tailpipe or from the atmosphere of the combustion of fossil fuels and store those greenhouse gas emissions so that you can continue to use fossil fuels, but still manage to avoid dangerous climate change. When using the word unabated in the European Council conclusions, we do not intend to signal that there would be significant continued use of fossil fuels within the global energy system. We intend to signal that those technologies will be necessary in order for us to reach net zero, not because we continue to rely upon fossil fuels, but because there will be residual emissions. There will be hard to abate sectors on our pathway to net zero, and we need technologies in place to manage those. There will also be emissions from sectors beyond fossil fuels that will be very hard to abate in full. If you think about the land use sector, agricultural sector, methane, that will require technologies to capture and store CO2. The science clearly tells us from the IPCC that you have to be very careful in the deployment of these technologies, that you cannot rely upon them for a significant chunk of emissions for multiple reasons, one being their costs, but more importantly, we don't have the storage capacity to handle greenhouse gases captured through these technologies in such a way that would allow us to continue to rely on fossil fuels. They really need to be used only for the most residual uses. So you see in the way in which the EU captured its view on what a fossil fuel phase out would look like, many caveats and safeguards around that vision. The first part is making as clear as possible what we mean by a fossil fuel phase out, that coal cannot be part of the energy mix, that this needs to be achieved significantly in the current decade as we move to net zero by 2050. That we want this to be accompanied by a real push on renewable energy. We're calling for the tripling of installed energy capacity in the near term by 2030. It will require a doubling of efforts to improve energy efficiency at the same time. So it's not just the phase out, but also what needs to be phased in this period that the EU is emphasizing in those council conclusions. And then on the issue of abatement, we bound the use of abatement very clearly in that text as well, making sure that those technologies are causing no harm to other aspects of the environment as they need them. And that's how I've just done. The fact that these really need to be used for residual purposes in part to abate factors. So we're hoping that we can take that ambitious standard into the international negotiations and persuade the rest of the international community to follow through. There are some signs of hope. Certainly our progressive partners, which many of you might have heard referred to as the High Ambition Coalition, made up primarily of small island states, but also progressive voices from Latin America and from Africa are calling upon the international community to move in a similar direction. And we've had some very important reassurances from the incoming COP presidency, the UAE, that they also see that the end of fossil fuels as the backbone of the global economy is near, and they have to be part of that transition as well. They have promised us in joint statements, for example, that they share our view that global energy systems have to be free of unabated fossil fuels if we're going to reach the Paris Agreement goals. They have signed up to that language themselves. And they have also been very supportive of the renewable energy and energy efficiency targets too. There is also apparently in the pipeline, and we think this is a really important opportunity that can't be lost as a result of the UAE hosting COP28, a commitment from the oil and gas sector itself, represented by oil and gas majors. We don't know the details of it yet, but we expect it to spell out more clearly how they're, as a sector, going to be contributing to this closeout as well. There's a lot more that I can say, but I think it's better if I stop here and see where colleagues' interests lie, to see whether I can answer the questions beyond what I've already tried to set up now.
Thanks, Jake. I think that a very quick tour of what is going to be a very complex set of discussions and long evenings, I suspect, which doesn't give me the joy, but this is what this business is. A couple of things before I pass it on to the audience. What you expect the joint question? You expect unabated fossil fuel language to be in some kind of a COP decision, some kind of a cover decision? Actually, part of is it a side thing, or is it part and parcel of some decision on language? And the way, I mean, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but is this going to be accompanied by something about abatement and removals and some kind of initiative, something that talks about removals that in some way, removals have been something that we've talked about for a long time, but you know, they are where they are. And I think there are people who are saying, okay, we made a lot of progress on renewables, maybe we can make a lot of progress on removals. Different people understand different things by what is abatement and capturing and removals.
Yeah. Well, for those of you who are COP watchers, you know that increasingly there have been these two tracks of the process. One is what the presidency refers to as negotiated outcomes. That's the COP decisions, whether it's a cover decision or it's what will be a very broad and far-reaching GST outcome. Those are negotiated by the parties. They're agreed multilaterally. In parallel to that, you have non-negotiated outcomes, some of which are initiated by the presidency itself, and they have initiated a lot of them. And they've described this COP as being inclusive. I think from their point of view, that's not just making sure that everyone feels invited, but also that they cover as many issues as possible. And I think they're doing that because they feel that will help move the negotiations forward more smoothly. if, for example, as I said before, there's a dynamic where we're pushing really hard on mitigation, and there's less that's emerging on adaptation, they can point to the outcomes that they're pushing for on health and food security as a contribution from the international community as to what we're going to be doing to strengthen resilience. But those pledges are either led by the presidency itself, or sometimes they're led by parties and groups of parties. We as the EU are pushing pledges and trying to get countries to sign up to pledges on the goals that I already mentioned in the context of the global energy transition, about renewables and about energy efficiency in the context of a fossil fuel phase out. These two processes are intended to support each other, but they also can shore each other up in circumstances where you get less under one track and need to make up for it on another track. So to your question of where would we like to see the message about fossil fuel phase out, and if it's unabated, and safeguards around abatement, we want them in the negotiated outcomes, because the most powerful messages, signals that come from this process are those that you could reach consensus by 190 plus countries. That's the most powerful message. You can then back those messages up with more specific pledges from a coalition of the willing, as the kind that we're trying to build around renewable energy. But it's not one or the other. We're aiming for both. I think it's too early to say the political likelihood for the outcome. We know that we really struggled in a G20 context to get the major economies to sign up to any aspect of this vision other than the renewables, which everyone seems comfortable with. And so it's not going to be easy to persuade other major economies that continue to be dependent on coal and other fossil fuels more than, for example, the EU at the moment. But we're certainly going to try, and it would be a benchmark for us for success in the topic of that full messages across in the negotiated outcomes. And we're hoping that when you move from a G20 context where it's become much more of a rivalry between the G7, which considers itself to be terribly ambitious, and the balance of the G20, which kind of resents that perspective, but also doesn't feel like they should immediately swallow everything that the G7 agrees amongst itself. When we move out of that G20 dynamic to a more multilateral one, where you have the major economies outside of the G7 being put under pressure, not just by the G7, but also by vulnerable developing countries, that you'll be able to move them more to join in a more ambitious outcome.
One more thing before I pass it on. You talked about loss and damage and the fact that the fourth meeting didn't deliver the way. There were 3 meetings initially. We had a 4 meeting, hoping that now we have a 5 meeting, the 5th meeting. It is an important topic for some parties. It's a very important topic for some parties, but some see it also as an open-ended blank check in some degree. It's this reality of what it is. I can tell you that I run into for instance, into people from a very large business federation in Sharm el Sheikh. My question, what are you guys doing here? I thought they were having coffee. But actually they were there to look at loss and damage. To my eternal surprise, I didn't know they knew how to spell loss and damage, but they did. And I think there is some anxiety, if you want, that this all these windfall profits and so on may end up being directed, or there may be additional stuff. Is this something that can you talk a little bit about why you did reach an agreement? Because my understanding is around the governance, where this is going to be and how it's going to be. The other one is who funds this. I mean, who pays the bill? Invariably, that's where the funds are.
I was hoping you were telling me that those companies or private sector interests were discussing how they could make a generous contribution.
No, I don't think that was on their mind.
That was on their mind. That was a shame. Because we did agree in Sharm that we would try to broaden the donor base for this particular effort at loss and damage, given the potential scale of the needs associated with it. But yeah, I mean, the 3 issues that were unresolved, the 3 main issues that were unresolved at the end of TC4, and that ministers will be looking at the pre-COP are 2 of the ones that you mentioned. First, the location, whether this would be a fund that is based in an existing institution, and in particular the World Bank, it's the only institution that's been proposed specifically to host it, or whether it will go into some kind of standalone arrangement. And I think that I think we're beginning to close the gap in that, because I think the bank was having difficulty saying fully yes to everything that was being asked to do, because what it was being asked to do was kind of emerging as the negotiations went on. We hadn't clearly identified what the scope of the fund would be, what kinds of modalities it would use, what priorities it would be investing in. But I think as that has become clear, so has the degree of comfort that the bank, at least on an interim basis, is prepared to take it forward. The alternative would be to not know where this thing is housed in Dubai, and therefore open up another several years of trying to find an institution that could come forward and meet the functions that the fund wishes to perform. The other key issue which you didn't mention, which is critically important to us and to many others involved in the committee, is how does the fund ensure that it's reaching the particularly vulnerable developing countries, as was the mandate from Sharm. It's been very difficult, as you can imagine, in a committee that's made up of a variety of developing countries, for any one of them to agree that they would not be eligible for the fund. So there is no, I think, real prospect of saying that only this group of countries is eligible. But there still is the challenge of prioritizing amongst those eligible developing countries, which will get priority access to resources that inevitably will be limited in relation to needs. So that conversation has been moving forward, and I think we've made a lot of progress. We are coming up with a way of empowering the board, because essentially we're running out of time ourselves, to design a kind of a real resource allocation system that would allow it to look at different aspects of climate impacts, whether it's slow onset events, it's extreme weather events, its vulnerability to debt, its non-economic losses, and in those different contexts, figure out a system of allocation that would identify where needs intersect with capacities. And where the needs are highest and where the capacities are lowest is where the fund would prioritize the investment of its resources. But that is still open. There is still resistance among some on the committee that this could lead to a prioritization that would somehow leave them out of benefiting from the fund. And then the third issue, which you did mention, was the issue of sources. Where's all the money coming from? There are many legal arguments that I think are quite sound that puts the Loss and Damage Fund in a different space than many of the past funding arrangements that have been agreed on the regime. The Green Climate Fund, for example, emerged under the convention, which has a clear distinction between developed and developing countries by definition, and was in the context in which the developed countries have made a commitment of delivering $100 billion annually in climate finance, and had signaled that they expect that the Green Climate Fund would be a major player in managing those resources. So we had already identified the donor base in advance. There's nothing in the Paris Agreement that does that. Article 8 on loss and damages is separate and distinct. And so that opens a space that allows us to think again about where the donor base should come from. Clearly, it will be governments, and clearly there are some governments, and I would include European governments in this context, that are willing to take the lead in supporting this fund. But at the same time, we realize that we have to broaden that donor base, and that since 1992, the capacities of governments to contribute to this kind of fund has grown very significantly beyond the traditional donor and contributor category of developed countries. And so we want this fund to be able to recognize and acknowledge that. And that obviously is causing some divisions between countries. And we're hoping to get more ministerial guidance as a result of the
Well, listen, I think I spoke too much, and I think raised a few issues, but in the end, I also would like to make sure that people who have joined us today kind of find themselves have the opportunity to speak. So I'm just looking around the I'll just go to that lady from Reuters, right?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
If you can stand up and speak loudly, I think these mics are supposed to be wonders, but I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm Kate Abnett. I'm a journalist from Reuters. Thank you, Jake, for doing this. I just wanted to ask more about the donor base for the Loss and Damage Fund. Firstly, to what degree do you see any parties being on the hook to contribute? Is this a voluntary fund, or will there actually be some obligation? And then regarding that expansion of the donor base, I mean, it's quite obvious why a party like the EU would want this expanded, but for parties like China, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, whoever else that might be pointed at, why would they agree to be brought into the donor base? What's the incentive for them to agree to it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that, no specific country is fully on the hook, and many countries aren't fully off the hook. But this won't be a fund that has any kind of legally binding obligation on any party to contribute. And in fact, no previously created fund really does either. I mean, you can find some language that indicates that, for example, developed countries shall contribute, but that's a collective obligation. And there is an open debate about what the definition in 2023 is of a developed country, and it also is an unquantified obligation. So, it's not exactly a situation where you could say 100% any one particular country was required or expected to deliver a particular amount. You're absolutely right that countries like Singapore and Saudi Arabia and China would push back on this notion that a broadened donor base somehow includes them. What would incentivize them to do so? Well, we hope that the same thing that incentivizes us to be willing to contribute, which is a sense of global solidarity and a recognition that we have all increasingly been a part of causing this problem. And every country that you mentioned, I think, as a matter of fact, has, to different degrees, but has. And so would feel a sense of moral obligation in wanting to support such an initiative.
Darius, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thank you, Darius. A quick question, Jake, on the facilitated nature of Paris Agreement in general, because it's already 5 years since the dialogue we started in Katowice. So any lesson learned? I know when we negotiated the Paris Agreement, there was a question how it will work in the reality. So now maybe we can have already this final expectation of seeing the global stock take in action in Dubai. And a quick question to Andre as well about this particular presidency, because I know they put a lot of focus on the transition in particular, which is close to heart for your CSP. Maybe you have a comment as well, what the expectations for the Dr. Sultan and the others to bring as an added value at this point.
Sorry, I think we're in a different kind of pay of grades, but go ahead.
Well, Darius, thanks for the question. I mean, by the facilitative nature of the Paris Agreement, I would interpret you as meaning the fact that the NDCs themselves aren't negotiated and they aren't legally binding with regard to their results. So the EU signs up to at least 55%. That's binding domestically for us because it's part of our climate law. But the Paris Agreement itself does not characterize that obligation as being binding. So we have to look at other means of encouraging countries to not only set on targets, but also to follow through with them. I would say that from one perspective, the bottom-up aspect of Paris has worked. I mean, you've seen, I'm sure, the IEA analysis, which shows that between Paris and now, if you look at the policies and the targets that have been put in place, that if those policies and targets are fully implemented, we would have significantly reduced by several degrees the amount of global average temperature rise that could have been incurred. And that was through essentially political pressure, the Talanoa dialogue, the UN Secretary General insisting that countries continuously increase the level of ambition of their NDCs. And it's worked to a point. There's a very important assumption, of course, in the analysis, which is that the policy is going to be fully implemented. And that Paris hasn't demonstrated yet, that it's able to do that through this bottom-up and facilitative approach. But we won't know that, of course, until 2030, when the current targets stretch out until the end of this decade. But in the meantime, the enhanced transparency framework will kick in, and so parties will be required, and this is legally binding, to report on their progress. And hopefully we'll see from that piece of the Paris machinery kicking in. I sit on the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, which was set up to kind of backstop the transparency system. So if any party failed to meet one of its binding obligations under Paris, that case would be clearly identified and the committee would follow up. We've had 2 cases so far, and in each case, the party was contacted, informed that they were out of compliance, and each case they complied. So hopefully, even though there was no kind of stick involved other than the public naming of a party, the combination of countries constantly saying how much they care about the Paris Agreement, and the fact that they will be held transparently accountable for whether they're following through on their commitments will produce that kind of result without there being a big stick at the end of the process.
Well, look, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure why you're asking me this question, but nevertheless, you asked me that question. I only met Sultan once in circumstances that I can tell you privately. We were in Abu Dhabi. My sense is that he's not in an easy position. It's a difficult position. He is the president of the COP, but he's also the head of ADNOC. So he runs a very large oil and gas company. He has been attacked in public by a number of lawmakers on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that he is being very careful as to how he maneuvers this. The UAE has been traditionally quite forward. I remember they had quite progressive delegations over the years. They are in a situation where obviously they need to be honest brokers. At least, that's what the presidency does. In some ways, in my personal opinion, if I may say so, I hope I'm not barred from the UAE, but I think they have come out to this position sometimes that maybe they're premature, maybe in my view, but maybe because of these circumstances, being an oil-producing country, they need to be seen more proactive. But as Jake has mentioned, I think they have been quite forthcoming and trying to be progressive and committed to this transition. I think I would guess in my own mind, there's probably some limit, because no matter how they do it, they still pump oil and all those things run on oil. So I think the unabated part is probably going to be difficult for them as well as for their cousins across the globe. And they are, there is a big country can overshadow in the world with their cousins. So that may, how that is going to play is everybody's guess, but they do have quite a lot of advisors that are coming from the UK, from France, from other countries. So I think they're listening to everybody, and hopefully with the team that they have, they will be honest brokers. And beyond that, I'm sorry, I'm just not something that either I can say or I don't know. So I will stop here. I think that we have 2 people on the line since we gave people the opportunity to come on the line. One of them is Marta, the other one is Juho Lipponen. So are you guys still there? Marta, yeah, and Juho. So Marta, let's take the question. First, Marta, introduce yourself. Juho, I can introduce you. I know who you are, but Marta, can you introduce yourself very quickly, please? I'm sorry, but you're muted. The picture is very clear, but the sound ain't. I'm sorry, I don't hear the sound.
Remove headphones.
Juho, do you want to go first?
How about now?
Yeah, you go ahead.
No? Still no? Yes? Okay. Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry if I'm going to ask something that you already said, because the sound on this side is not really good. But I was wondering if you could tell us what is the EU position regarding the getting the private sector to finance, to contribute to the climate fund, and also where does the EU stand regarding the mitigation work program? if that should continue parallel to the GST, or that should be putting aside. What's the EU position?
Can you tell us where you from? I didn't see our EFE. I'm not quite sure what it is. I apologize for that. Spanish bread, yeah?
Yeah.
Well, there you have, we have one knows Spanish bread, so I stand corrected. you Clean Energy Ministerial, that one I can say.
Okay, hi, I hope this is audible. Yeah, so Juho Lipponen, I coordinate the carbon capture, use and storage initiative under the Clean Energy Ministerial. And Andre and team, thanks for the meeting and the opportunity. And Jacob, nice to meet you. And thanks for the insights. My question is about these pledges around around COP. We know the tripling of renewables, a wonderful goal that has been presented, doubling of energy efficiency rate improvement by 2030 as well. There may be others. And there's also another one which was launched back in April by President Biden at the Major Economies Forum, which is the Carbon Management Challenge. It has received less attention, but essentially it is a call or project to get governments to rally around a target of getting carbon management, or CCUS and CDR, into gigaton scale by 2030, which is also super ambitious as a target. And European Commission is one of the signatories or supporters of this. And I was wondering, Jacob, if you could say what kind of role this type of target could play in your mind in the overall results of this COP, and is this something that the European Commission could also actively advance through the process and through the negotiations in Dubai? Thank you.
Yeah, that's kind of Jake and I talked about unabated fossil fuels, and does that come with the cousin with the removals target of some sort or initiative?
Yeah, okay. Should I?
Please.
Okay. So I think the first question was, what is the EU's view on the potential for the private sector to contribute to the loss and damage fund and potentially to other funds as well? We definitely want to set up a fund that is able to receive contributions from any source, including the private sector. And I think that there is a lot of openness to that within the transitional committee members. But the same question comes up with regard to, that was raised with regard to Singapore and China, comes up with regard to private sector as well. What's their incentive to do so? I think it's not clear what their incentive is to do so. I mean, within the private sector, of course, you have philanthropies, but I don't expect that to be a significant amount of money. But I think you can see in the EU Council conclusions the little seed of an idea of what might be the future direction of this effort to get the private sector to contribute more. And that's the reference to the fossil fuel industry playing a role in the context of climate finance and providing finance. And I think there is increasingly a recognition that the combination of the need to send signals to the marketplace that carbon has a price, and the need to identify and generate more revenues could lead to the use of more and more taxes and charges on the fossil fuel sector as a way of channeling money and creating incentives for more emissions reduction. There are more specific ideas that are being run not so much by the EU, but by parts of the EU. You see, for example, some countries talking about air passenger levies, others talking about windfall charges on oil and gas windfall profits. But these ideas haven't quite coalesced yet. But I think that's where the potential lies, is more and more coordination on recognizing that it's good for the environment, but also good for generating revenues that can be invested in good things like loss and damage, if we can use those tools more effectively. On the mitigation work program, for those of you who don't know about this work program, it was launched in an effort to make sure that even as we begin to focus more and more on post-2030, the GST obviously has that strong dimension of generating the next round of NDCs, that we don't forget that it's action in this decade that really will make a difference in terms of avoiding a 1.5 degree global average temperature rise. So the mitigation work program was established and has been running for a year now. And we do expect, and it already has a mandate, to run beyond Dubai for another couple of years to keep the pressure on the pre-2030 efforts. So, our renewable energy and energy efficiency target fits into that category as well. They are both pre-2030 targets. And so they would also be in the mix of conversations on the mitigation work program. In terms of the carbon management challenge, we, of course, welcomed its launch by the US and are contributing to it. But for a number of reasons that already came up in our discussion of the delicate politics around abatement, we have decided that this is not something that we really want to lead on. We are taking steps within the EU to make sure that the technologies are being developed and the infrastructure is being developed to be able to manage, to capture carbon and to store it and transport it effectively. So we recognize that there is a carbon management challenge, and we're taking it on in the EU, and we certainly will be supporting others to do it as well. But in terms of the political framing of the EU's top asks, we decided that pushing on renewables and energy efficiency is a better story, given the political sensitivities and the risks around emphasizing abatement too much, particularly in the COP hosted in Dubai.
Let me go to the gentleman here. Go ahead, please. Can you speak up, please?
Okay.
Because I think that's
Loud enough? Okay. Tom Weigler from German Press. You mentioned earlier 2 countries who failed on their obligations from Paris. Could you tell us what countries were and what was it about?
I can't tell you the countries, but they will be published as part of the committee's report in Dubai. So you could wait for them. You can also try to figure it out yourself. But one obligation was the obligation to have an NDC. Paris is very clear about this. If you're going to become a party, you've got to have an NDC. And a very recent joiner of the Paris Agreement hadn't fully appreciated that there was a time element to that obligation, and became a party and did not have an NDC, and they now do. The other is an obligation on developed countries to provide financing reports under Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. And here, our job was a little trickier because, as I said before, the Paris Agreement doesn't define who is a developed country. The Framework Convention does in Annex 1, and more particularly in Annex 2. The Paris Agreement doesn't. We did notice that many countries in Annex 2 of the convention have produced their reports under the Paris Agreement, but a few haven't. And so we decided, because this was our mandate, if the report isn't there, we have to contact the party and remind them that we would basically use the guidance from the convention to approach first those countries that are clearly developed and have always behaved as developed. And one of them hadn't submitted its report. We contacted them, and they followed through with the report. So nothing particularly earth-shattering, but it still demonstrates that the system works, and in the right circumstances can generate the right result.
Just a follow-up. What would be in this financing report? What would they have to report that?
What would be the question? What would be in this financing report?
Yes. What they had provided in terms of climate finance in the previous year, I think, or 2 years, maybe financing report.
John Cooper?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. John Cooper, Field Europe. Jake, we've met and discussed a little before. My question is around international carbon markets, making Article 6 work, because you may know we've been part of those discussions on a number of occasions with different parties. And my understanding of where the European Commission has been on this, and I'll paraphrase, correct me if I'm misrepresenting this, actually, we don't want to be part of this really. We want most of the money or all of the money that we spend in Europe to be spent inside Europe for those carbon reductions. That's kind of what I heard from people from America, Maybe it's not quite an accurate quote, but that was the spirit of it. I'm intrigued by the kind of difference between that and now a willingness to contribute to the loss and damage fund. And I'm certainly aware that parts of the private sector would be quite like to be able to have an opportunity to be buying carbon reductions from other parts of the world and have a more efficient global carbon market. Has anything changed? Is there anything you can update us on how Europe will now approach Article 6 of global carbon markets?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Article 6, as you know, is not first and foremost a financing mechanism, right? It's a means by which countries can more cost effectively achieve their emissions reductions. And so the whole system depends upon anything that is bought or sold within it to represent a genuine emissions reduction. Otherwise, the transaction will lead to growing emissions overall. And so what you would have heard my previous boss, Mauro, have said is that the EU, in designing its domestic target, decided to achieve all of its emissions reductions domestically. Didn't decide not to fund good projects to reduce emissions in other countries, which we do. We just don't do it through Article 6. We do it through development cooperation and facilitating private investment through things like the Global Gateway. And the reason that we decided to do that is because we committed to make sure that Europe was the first net zero region. And the only way that we can do that is by focusing on emissions reduction at home and not abroad. We also did it because we had some very bad experiences with international carbon markets under the Kyoto Protocol, where when we opened up our system to offsets produced in other countries, it turned out that the offsets were not of high quality. They were very low cost. And so they effectively undermined the effectiveness of our own system. We're very much hoping that the Article 6 rules will help address some of these issues. And I wouldn't rule out that at some future point in time, after we complete our 2030 targets, that we might have a more open mind to involving international carbon markets as part of a cost-effective way of reducing emissions, but never first and foremost as a way of financing activities overseas. There are other channels available to do that. And so that's also the way I would distinguish it between our willingness to support the loss and damage fund and our willingness to participate in international carbon markets. They're two different things in our view.
I have to say this, and I'm terribly sorry. We've known each other for many years. I will take issue with your characterization of the Kyoto Protocol market, but we can have that discussion somewhere else.
I think we've had it before. We haven't persuaded each other.
I don't think we do. But nevertheless, there's another point that I actually had it on my list here. President von der Leyen went to Nairobi, and it was in the Financial Times that she spoke about the power of international carbon markets and renewables and Africa and so on. You have it somewhere. And then also there is the Paris-aligned carbon markets and President Macron's summit in Paris. That all seem to come together. In my mind, they are going the same direction, quality, but also especially maybe renewables being a way of starting this whole discussion. Is there something that indeed the EU sees is something I'm thinking in the EU around these lines?
Absolutely, and thank you for reminding me of the carbon markets pledge, the pledge for Paris-aligned carbon markets that we signed up to at the Macron summit, and that we're now trying to encourage other countries to join as well. That has to do, as you said, with quality. We even though we're not participating in international carbon markets in the Article 6 sense, we still have an interest, and we think every country should have an interest that the standards applied to those markets, as well as the standards applied to voluntary markets, are as high as possible, so that we're not participating in repeating the mistakes of Kyoto. Or even worse, creating a new opportunity for corporate greenwashing, where this concept of net zero becomes a marketing ploy, underpinned not by genuine corporate emissions reductions, but instead by their buying cheap offsets through voluntary markets. So the Paris Pledge, again, thanks for reminding me of it, is a way of trying to align those that are enthusiastic about carbon pricing and carbon markets, and the EU is definitely enthusiastic about these as effective policy tools, are aware that when you begin to link different markets, as do international carbon markets, new risks arise that can undermine the effectiveness of your own market if you're not careful.
There was discussion to be had.
An ongoing discussion.
Discussion. Discussion. The gentleman over there, please.
Hi, Ignacio from E3G. Good to see you again, Jake. Good to see you. I have a question.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure everybody.
Should I stand up? Or? Ignacio Roni from E3G. We're in.
Oh, E3G, sorry, I didn't hear.
Thank you. I have a question about adaptation, the global carbon adaptation. Parties are struggling to find what the landing zone look like. Maybe you could comment a bit on like what your expectations for that could look like. And a follow-up to that would be on the domestic side of the EU as well. I would argue that maybe we found it a bit complicated to engage with the topic, rather because domestically there hasn't been much work either done. There's been talk of a climate risk preparedness assessment running through the Commission corridors. And I was wondering, we didn't see it in the Commission working plan for the next year. Where has it gone? And should we still expect it?
Absolutely, it's alive and well, and it's one of the 3 priorities of the incoming Belgian presidency, because as we've all experienced, we're not prepared ourselves for climate change in terms of this movement. So we have to work harder at building European resilience. Yes, again, if you think of the Council conclusions as a kind of a microcosm of the international negotiations, you'll see that they are weaker on adaptation in terms of our expectations of the GST. And the reason that we tell ourselves this is the case is because adaptation doesn't lend itself as well to setting targets and goals that are clear and quantifiable and measurable. And that it's even more difficult when you try to aggregate individual actions on adaptation in the way that you can with regard to global emissions. That's true. It's true. And so when you try to look at parity or parallelism between setting goals and adaptation and mitigation, it's very fraught. There's one area where it's quite easy, which is around finance, where the developing countries have been pressuring us to develop more and more specific goals about adaptation finance. And we agreed in Glasgow to set the first goal around climate finance, which is to double adaptation finance. I can't remember the dates, but I think it's by 20, well, in the near to midterm. And we're on a pathway to doing that, but we're reluctant to continue to come back to adaptation as if the only challenge is where the money is going to come from. That is a real challenge for many countries. So short of that, I think that there has been some progress through this work program on the global goal on adaptation that focuses on process rather than outcomes per se. There's a broad recognition that in order to do adaptation well, you need to have an adaptation policy cycle that is made up of clear steps that start with an assessment of vulnerability, that move into the policy making phase as to how you're going to address vulnerability, and then assess over time whether you've been successful, and then come back to the beginning again to strengthen the policy. There's wide agreement on that, and there are specific instruments that the international process has developed to help particularly developing countries deal with that. The national adaptation plans are an example of that. And I think everyone has agreed that there aren't enough of them, and those that exist haven't been sufficiently supported. So there you can get into some kind of quantified goals in terms of increasing the number of NAPs that have been developed, these national adaptation plans, and checking to see whether they're being implemented over time. Beyond that, I think that there is a whole set of indicators that have been developed in the context of climate policy, but also in other policy areas as well, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, that can help individual countries set priorities and targets in terms of improving things like the responsiveness of the healthcare sector to climate impacts, the responsiveness of the food sector to food security challenges, and using those goals as more of a menu than as a collective global target is also something that I think that will emerge as part of the GST conversations. I know all that sounds less satisfying, but if you talk to an adaptation practitioner rather than an adaptation negotiator, they actually say that makes a lot of sense to continue to push in that direction. Which we haven't been comfortable with is global goals such as reducing the number of people that are vulnerable to climate change by 50% within the next decade, and then by 100% by the decade after that. It sounds, I guess, attractive, but it's very difficult to imagine how you would then convert that into something that was implementable. I don't think that we really have a full understanding of what the baseline for that would be. And I think there are many developing countries actually nervous about that because it would be a hugely amount their responsibility to achieve that goal, and they're reluctant to commit to it in that same sense.
Yes, one quick question at the back there, but if you want to keep it short, please.
Sure, Andrei Mielik, Balisem consulting firm. Very quick one regarding any possible agreement specifically on methane emission reduction. Would you expect anything progressing on methane emission reduction specifically or not?
You're with the consulting firm from?
Discovery.
Well, we are part of, as I'm sure you know, the EU is part of and leading with the US in something called the Global Methane Pledge, which does have a specific aggregate target attached to it. And you may remind me of what it is. I think it's 40%.
Minus 30 by 2030.
Minus 30. Thank you. Our former climate ambassador, who always knew more about the non-negotiated outcomes than I. But yes, and who led for 18 months or 2 years on this Global Methane Pledge from its inception. To many now having how many partners? Over 150. Yeah. But that's in the non-negotiated space. I would expect that there will be something on the negotiated outcome on non-CO2 gases, as there has been in previous, maybe a specific mention of methane, but I haven't heard any proposals for a specific methane-related target from the negotiated space. So we'll have to carry on Mark's good work on the methane pledge in order to get that.
Two things because I think we said 15, we'd like to keep to 15. One of them is this is all good and interesting conversation, but you're going to come back here and according to climate law, you're going to have to do something about, not you personally necessarily, but we all, about the 2040 target.
Yes.
And how is this all could impact, the GST, in Canada, GST is the good and services tax, but that's okay. The GSP and other things. All these things that you're discussing in the COP, what kind of impact could it possibly have on the 2040 target? The other thing that, listen, Mike Manning and myself and Aaron Cosby, we were for the last week traveling from India to Turkey on dealing with trade and climate change. And I don't need to tell you what was the highlight of every discussion, no matter how much we turn it around, it revolved around 4 letters.
Deforestation.
Yeah, it's more than around CBAM, and whether this has been brought up and has been rejected by a number of countries that are not belonging into this negotiation, belonging to someone else. But anyway, so would you see a correlation between what's happening there and what's going to happen here? And do you think this is going to become an issue, or you don't think the CBAM is going to be any kind of issue at the COP?
Well, you have to leave something for your next seminar, Andre. I mean, the 2040 target is still a twinkle in the eye of the Commission, I would say. But I mean, if you listened to, and as I'm sure you did, Commissioner Hoekstra's parliamentary hearings, you know that from his point of view, he is going to be sticking to the ambition that was set in the climate law and the agreement that the Commission's response to the global stocktake would be based in part on the advice from the Scientific Advisory Board, which has advised us that our 2040 target has to be somewhere between 90 and 95% below 1990 levels by 2040. So, that is his mandate, and we will see, in the early stages of the development of that target in the course of this commission, how member states and other stakeholders respond to that. But you know, it is getting to crunch time. If you want to be net zero by 2050, draw the line. You know, there's no escaping it if that's your categorical imperative. And the challenge is then gearing up the policies to get us there and to make sure that Europe continues to thrive under those circumstances, and that others follow our lead, which of course takes us to the trade-related climate policies.
Which I know you like.
Well, intellectually, absolutely.
No,
They're
you're quite
fascinating.
familiar with the topic. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
not kidding.
Yeah. I mean, we know that there is a diplomatic challenge around CBAM and deforestation in persuading our trading partners to buy new seasonal necessary. And also very challenging explaining how it is that they can comply with them, because they're both very complicated pieces of legislation. And we're working very closely with our colleagues in TaxUD and our colleagues in DG Trade and DG Environment to make sure that the diplomacy around the rollout of those two policies in particular works well. In terms of conversations at the COP, I am sure we will continue to hear references to unilateral trade measures as being incompatible with the Paris Agreement and of great concern to many of our trading partners. But it won't be negotiated in Dubai. There will be a space, as you know, something called the Response Measures Forum, which takes up the issue of trade, as well as the issue of economic diversification and just transition. And you know, we will talk about CBAM and other trade-related issues as we have before in the Response Measures Forum. But we will also continue to maintain that if you want to negotiate trade, this isn't the space to do it. It's at the WTO. There is a trade day, as you know, also that the Emiratis have decided to have at this COP, and they're co-designing it with WTO, and I believe UNCTAD is part of the design of the trade day as well. And our understanding is the main thrust there is to make trade a positive agenda, to recognize, I think as everyone does, that trade managed in the right way can be a significant contributor to accelerate emissions reductions through open markets, but also, in our point of view, regulated open markets. And to me, that's the only way it can work, is if markets and consumers are able to distinguish between products that are carbon intensive and those that aren't, and that governments help amplify those signals with measures like CBAM.
Rick, listen, we wish you all well, and all your colleagues. As a token of our appreciation and wishing you well, we have something for you. I don't know, we had in there a t-shirt.
You know how long I've
I know, I know. Actually, we are very close, and I'm sure you were wearing that at all.
it's in certain circumstances, yeah. Thank you.